Welcome, everyone. So excited to have all of you here, and I'm thrilled to be hosting this program. My name is Bethany Tabor. I'm the Senior Program Officer at the New Mexico Humanities Council, and I'm managing the virtual event today. Thank you so much again for joining us, to our guests and our speakers. Before we get the conversation underway, I want to just announce some housekeeping rules. This conversation will be amongst the panelists and the moderator, and we do invite you to ask questions throughout by typing your questions in the chat. And our moderator, Jessica, will be looking at those and sort of answering questions throughout the conversation. Any questions that you have, we strive to make our discussions respectful and friendly. So please keep your questions also to those standards. And also, please be sure to stay until the end, as we'll have a closing musical performance by Rob Martinez, playing the Ballad of La Llorona. And with that, let's get started. We're very excited to present this program, a live Starting Conversations. Usually the Starting Conversations series are published video series on our NMHC YouTube channel. So it's such a privilege to have this conversation live with you all. And we will be delving into New Mexico folklore, witchcraft trials of Abiquiu, ghostly encounters, haunted places, strange phenomena, and some of the cultural traditions of brujeria, hechiceras, rooted in New Mexico's history. And we are thrilled to have our guest speakers, Rob Martinez, the current New Mexico State Historian, Rick Hendricks, former New Mexico State Historian and author of Witches of Abiquiu, Donna Blake Birchell, author of Haunted Hotels and Ghostly Getaways of New Mexico, and Christine Rogel, author of Haunted New Mexico. And the discussion will be moderated by poet and former Albuquerque Poet Laureate, Jessica Helen Lopez. Thank you again for coming, and Jessica, I will hand it over to you.
Thank you so very much, Bethany. So I am actually not in New Mexico right this second. I am in Pierre, South Dakota, which is the capital of South Dakota. I'm here working with one of our schools out on the Rosebud Reservation, Wakanyeshaki Tokehachi. But I am a diehard New Mexican, and I'm so excited to moderate this panel of such amazing, vast, diverse stories and the authors who wrote them to share with us. So I've got a general question that I'd like to kick off. I mean, it's spooky season, and here in South Dakota, right now, the winds are whipping across the plains and kind of battering against my large hotel window. So I feel uber spooky right now. But this is a general question for all of the lovely authors that are at this panel. And thank you so much for allowing me to have this plática with you, this conversation about culture and spectrals, and also the topography and peoples of the rich history and present day Nuevo Mexico. I'm really, really curious, as a storyteller myself, how did you approach putting together the stories that you did to share with us through your titles? I'm thinking about the story collection aspect of it, of your writing. Where did you begin as far as collecting the stories, thinking about who to speak to, about what parts of Nuevo Mexico you wanted to travel to in order to do so? And then maybe you can give us a little overview about the title that Bethany mentioned that we're discussing today, so we can all get some context around your works. And I'd love to pop it over first to Rick Hendricks, co-author, I believe, of The Witches of Abiquiu.
So the story came about in the way things come to most historians. There was a significant body of material related to this outbreak of witchcraft. And interestingly enough, Rob had done work on the documents for his master's thesis at UNM. I had originally intended for Rob to help to be a partner on the project with Malcolm Ebright, who really sought me out. The main reason I became involved is is the language of the Franciscan priest who was writing about this outbreak is really quite convoluted. And my co-author, Malcolm Ebright, really needed somebody who could handle the mid-18th century Spanish. And that's really how I came to it. And really the approach that we used was simply to relate the story in the way that the people who lived it related it. So we tried to, generally speaking, avoid trying to put a modern interpretation on it and just tell the story the way it was lived by the people and recorded in the document. So that was how I came to the story, and that was the approach to telling that story. Briefly, it was a witchcraft trial in the middle of the 18th century in Abiquiu, which was very much a frontier community in New Mexico. And although it's not that well known and certainly not as celebrated as the events that happened in Salem, Massachusetts in the 17th century, it's every bit as interesting, and it actually bears a lot of similarities. So.
For folks who are unfamiliar with the Witches of Abiquiu and the trials, or at least the convening of religious leaders that came together to speak to the idea that maybe the governor at the time was bewitched and therefore said, hey, I think that we should allow the Comanche and the Ute people of the area to practice their spirituality. But they came together, if I'm not mistaken, right, to discuss what strange phenomenon they thought that they witnessed at that time. I think that's where we really unpack those stories that were shared across the community. Can you select one and share it with us, or share it with the audience members who are here in the Zoom?
Well, I mean, I suppose when the episode moves into an exploration of what was going on, there's a pretty dramatic scene that happens in a cave that was described as being a school for the devils, where you would really learn how to be a witch. So there's a young woman who is taken into the cave, and the idea is that they would teach her how to fly and various things, and she is required to kiss a toad and kiss a serpent. Just that sort of activity, which sounds very much like stories of witchcraft anywhere. And what happens is, while she's in there and she's undergoing this training, if you will, she starts to make references to the Holy Spirit and that sort of thing. And so the people who are teaching her to be witchcraft, they tell her not to do that, and essentially because she's sort of invoking her Catholicism, she gets thrown out of the school. So that's a very dramatic scene that happens, much more dramatic in reading it than the way I'm telling it. But the story is full of those kinds of things, which anyone familiar with the Western tradition of witchcraft from Europe or anywhere you would see similarities to the kind of things that are described in this story.
Thanks, Rick. And I know that it's steeped in the history of land grants and the Henezado people and the Catholic Church. I guess I want to pop this question over to you, Rob, because you're a current New Mexico State historian, And so the pavement hit the road when we talk about honoring history and relaying history to people today. Can you speak a little bit to that, thinking about stories and beliefs, and thinking about the titles that we're discussing now and how we convey them in modern times?
Yeah, well, thank you for having me. Bienvenidos. I would say this. I'm from Albuquerque, but my family is from northern New Mexico. My late father was from Moran. My late mom was from Las Vegas. So belief in brujas, witches, and hechiceras, sorcerers, that's in our DNA here in New Mexico. It's part of who we are, just like santos or penitentes or red and green chili. It's just part of who we are. And I grew up hearing these stories. I mean, when I was a kid, we'd go up to Mora, we'd help butcher a goat, and we would hear stories about brujas. And my parents would talk about how my grandma would say, que hay muchas brujas en Mora. So, these weren't just stories from the 1700s. They were beliefs in contemporary times. And I talk to people all the time who have similar stories. And as Rick pointed out, these ideas can be found in rural parts of the world everywhere. But for our presentation here today, New Mexico was definitely and still is a hotbed of these types of beliefs. What made it really interesting and drove it home for me was when I was in graduate school at UNM in the 1990s. I worked for Rick. Rick was and is still one of my mentors. I worked for Rick at the Vargas Project, but my mentor, another mentor I had was Professor John Kessel. And I remember, when I was a kid, my mom would drive me and my sister Debbie through northern New Mexico. And one time we were driving by Abiquiu. My dad said, "Look, kids, this is a town of brujas." Well, John Kessel told me one time at UNM, he said, Rob, I was reading an article by Richard Greenleaf, the expert on the Mexican Inquisition, and he had a footnote about an Inquisition document relating to hechiceros, sorcerers in Abiquiu. And that just really, set light bulbs off for me, because I'm like, well, I thought these were just cuentos, just stories we heard. But here was an actual historic document, a document from our history here in New Mexico, showing that these stories were not merely superstition, rather they were actual events. Now, we can discuss whether there was actual witchcraft or actual hauntings or ghosts or evil spirits, but we do know that these events are recorded in the documentary record. And that's really what drew my attention. On the one hand, the contemporary stories, as you're mentioning, that we have these ideas and beliefs today, but also they're deeply rooted in our history, in our ancestry, because we, Novo Mexicanos, we descend from Spanish colonists and settlers, but we also descend from Mexican Indians who had these types of beliefs. The Spanish people had these types of beliefs, the Puebloan people who are also our ancestors, and of course the hechiceras, who were the children of war, the servants and slaves caught up in warfare, children and women put in Spanish households, brought up to be Catholics, but not quite Catholicized, brought up to be Hispanic, but not totally Hispanic. They had to leave behind their culture, but not totally. So this is the cultural baggage we carry still today.
It's almost like the in-betweenness or the borderlands where things collide, come together and coalesce. Pragmatically speaking, I remember growing up in southern New Mexico. My family's from Deming. And in order to keep us away from jumping into the arroyos or the irrigation ditches, of course, they let us know that Llorona would get us, the wailing woman. And we were afraid to go out at night, late at night. Even later, when we were older teenagers, we didn't want to see La Llorona in the middle of the night. We did not want to hear her wailing. But, pragmatically, it kept us away from getting in danger. And it still haunts me literally to this day.
Well, it's not just La Llorona. I remember my family, my parents and my brothers and sisters, we went to Juarez for vacation. That was our international vacation. And we'd go with my aunt and uncle and my primos, my cousins, and we'd go to Juarez. And our parents would put us all in a hotel in downtown Juarez, and they'd say, "We're going out." don't leave. There are brujas here. So it was a way of keeping us in line.
A protection, if you will, brujas as babysitters. I'm going to kick it over to Donna. Donna Blake Birchell, author of Haunted Hotels and Ghostly Getaways of New Mexico. You know, I think we all have stories, right? Especially if we're from New Mexico. I'm thinking about the haunted hotel I stayed in Silver City, but that's another story. But Donna, can you tell us a little bit about your inspiration around writing this book? And I was really taken by your what you wrote in the beginning of your book, quote from Helen Keller: "Death is no more than passing from one room into another."
Right.
A type of portal per se. So can you speak a little bit to that, Miss Donna?
Yes, I kind of believe that we are on different planes, and when you die, you go to a different plane, and that's kind of, they're stuck in those in between planes. And my inspiration for haunted hotels was a personal experience, actually, and it was at the where'd I go? At the Plaza Hotel in Las Vegas. And I was working at the library at the time, and we went there for a mini conference. And I had read ahead that the Plaza Hotel was haunted, and I decided to test this. And I brazenly asked for the third floor, and the lady at the desk kind of gave me the look over her glasses, like, "Are you sure?" And, "Oh yeah, no problem." And I got up there, and I immediately started feeling something around me, somebody was watching me. And that I thought, okay, I'm just spooking myself out, no biggie. So I went and looked around at all the wonderful architecture that Las Vegas has to offer. They have over 400 homes and stuff on the National Register. So I'm a kind of an architectural geek, and I went around town, and I was getting ready for the evening, and it was very, very, very difficult to take a shower because I still had that feeling that something was watching me, and it really kind of freaked me out. And I went to bed, and I had all my swag from the conference around me, and I fell asleep with the light on. And I woke up and thought, oh, I got to get this cleaned up. So I went to move over on my side, and I was by myself. There was a pressure on my back. I could not move. I could not turn over. And of course, terror went up and down my arms. And I thought, well, this is what you were looking for, dum-dum, just. So I finally got my wits about me, and I finally told him, said out loud, "I've got a big day tomorrow. Could you kind of leave me alone?" And immediately they were gone. Immediately that feeling was gone. I didn't have any feeling of anybody watching me from that time on. And so that kind of sparked the want to find other hotels in New Mexico that had this kind of experience offered. And of course I found a ton, and I stayed at a lot of them, and it was fun. It's just a fun book to use as kind of a guide if you want to use a spooky guide to go around around New Mexico. That's the one to do.
Thank you. I saw that you wrote, at one time you were a self-proclaimed skeptic, but would you say that you now believe?
I do believe. I've had several instances, across my life. I never thought I would be considered I'm more of a sensitive, I think. I feel things, and I don't see things. I don't talk to devils or ghosts or anything like that, but I feel presences, and it's difficult. Even when I was a child, my parents and I visited Taos, and we went to the beautiful Millicent Rogers Museum in Taos. And at that time, they had the Penitente Chapel inside the museum, and it was an exterior room. And when my parents and I went in there, my mom and I sat down, and it was a little spooky because, you know, it had the skeletons and the carts and the whole idea of the penitentes, where it was a little frightening for a 12-year-old. And we were standing there, and all of a sudden the shutters slammed shut, the lights went out, the candles went out, and of course we left the building immediately. And it took me probably 40 years to get up enough nerve to go back there again. But it wasn't quite the same because now it's an interior room, so that made me feel better.
You know, I was just traveling recently and I stayed at the El Dorado Hotel in Gallup, New Mexico, which was built in, I believe, 1938 by the famed D.W. Griffith, a director, famed director of Hollywood, especially Westerns. And it wasn't touted as haunted, this hotel, but I surely felt presences there. All of the famous actors, John Wayne and folks, stayed there. And it has this long red carpet and stairwell that kind of unfurls like a big red tongue. You can't help but feel, well, at least, you know I'm walking through this hallway of history in a sense. So Michelle had a really great question. She put it in the chat. Donna, can you share, in your opinion, which hotel may be the most haunted in New Mexico?
Actually, it's not a hotel, it's a bed and breakfast. In Old Town, New Mexico, there's a place called the Painted Lady Bed and Brew. And it used to be an old brothel. Yeah, it used to be a grocery store. I mean, all sorts of things. And Jesse Heron runs it now, and he owns it. And he was telling me he was actually the savior of this book, because my editor would not publish this haunted hotels and ghostly getaways without an Albuquerque participation or Las Cruces participation. So, and I called everybody. And they were all like, we don't want to, we're not haunted. And, you know, yeah, okay, yeah. But they didn't want to mess with their brands. They wanted to set up a brand that they were going for, and they wanted to be known as an elegant hotel instead of a haunted hotel. But he helped me out, and he saved the day. And some of the stories he has to tell are just hair raising. I couldn't put them all in the book because I wanted people to actually want to stay there, because they were some horrendous. I would never go back myself. But it's not as bad now as I think he's got a few of the really bad ones out of there. And so but he's been a great supporter of mine, and I appreciate him so much. In fact, I just saw him last week, and he does the craft beer and stuff. So, and it's wonderful. It's a great experience, and he brings in authors for signings, and I really appreciate him doing that. But yes, he's got some stories.
Thank you for sharing that, Donna. And just a friendly reminder for folks that are tuning in, you can post a question in the chat box and then we'll get to it. Thank you so much, Michelle, for your question. We're going to hop on over to Christine. Christine, can you tell us a little bit about haunted New Mexico, ghosts and strange phenomena of the land of enchantment? I was really struck by the language in which you put together, in a lovingly but spectacular way, in describing these haunted places. Christine, can you speak to what was that kernel for you to start the research and the writing of this book?
Sure. Well, I'm a journalist by trade, and a publisher approached me about writing the book. I was in Montana at the time, but born and raised in Gallup, and I love New Mexico. I believe that it's probably one of the most unique places in the country based on its cultural diversity, the history that exists there, the landscapes, and of course, all this wonderful storytelling and mythology that seems to be a big part of the cultural fabric of the state. So when I was kind of putting together the book, I reflected back to my childhood and a lot of these stories that I grew up with, and it was this wonderful opportunity to go back and research them more in depth. And I was really looking for stories that were a little bit unusual or a little bit unique, maybe lesser known, in addition to some of the ones that I think a lot of us are familiar with.
So I'm going to pose a question to you, and this is for all of our panelists. I think about you all as storytellers, as writers, and storytellers, they collect stories from other storytellers. Donna, you were sharing how you collected some really interesting stories, right? From the hotel caretaker, the person that was there at that site. So my question for everyone is, what storyteller did you come across in the writing of your book that is really poignant to you? And can you share why? Maybe it is the story that you can kind of elevate for us, or maybe perhaps it's the way the story was told. I know that I become enchanted by different types of storytellers, whether it's through print, or oral, or performance, or for that matter, other mediums of art. So if you can like lock that in and think about somebody that you engaged with, the power of testimony, the power of story that inform the writing of your book. And then I would love to start with you, Christine, and we can work our way back. Sorry to put you on the spot, but I think you probably have a lot of stories about storytellers.
I do. I think that two really come to mind. One was a reverend in Taos, New Mexico, who I interviewed over the phone. I found him just by reading different newspaper sources, and gosh, I don't exactly know how I reached out to him, but I thought he was a wonderful source to speak about the Taos hum, because he had experienced it for decades. And, he said he had initially been a skeptic, moved to Taos, and then experienced it for himself. And so I think he was a fantastic source for me, just because I think he lends so much credibility to this myth, just based on his belief through his skepticism. So that really comes to mind for me. And then another one that comes to mind are two brothers who discovered the ghost town of Dawson, or the Dawson Cemetery. There was a terrible mining accident in Dawson, actually two mining accidents that took place 10 years apart. And 383 miners died in these accidents. The Phelps Dodge founded Dawson in 1906, and the mine was in operation until 1950. But after these two major mining accidents, and once the mine closed, the cemetery was just completely forgotten about. Grass kind of grew up over the mine tailings. The 383 iron crosses were kind of covered up with dirt and plants and completely forgotten about until 1991, when these two brothers were on a metal detecting mission in the Sangre de Cristos and came across a cemetery of nearly 400 crosses, and petitioned the New Mexico State Preservation Board to actually make it a National Historic Monument. So I think that was just incredible that this terrible mining accident happened, and then it was somewhat forgotten about and then rediscovered by these brothers. And I think a lot of the credit that's due to these men who gave their lives to industry, and also just the story of boom towns turning to ghost towns is just it was incredible. They were amazing to talk to, and to what a major contribution they made to New Mexico history as well.
Thank you so much, Christine. So I see we have another question in the chat. We're going to get to that very soon, Miss Ann Davis. But let's pop it over back to Donna, then Rob, and then Rick. If you could share with us a particular person, or maybe a storyteller that was poignant to you, in maybe not just the title that we're speaking of, but in general. I know that those have we have memories of folks that have shared those kind of stories with us. So Donna, and then Rob, and then Rick, por favor.
What started my interest in haunted hotels was the Trinity Hotel in Carlsbad. It is a fabulous place. It was it was built in 1892. It started life as a bank, and it had the first newspaper in there, and then it eventually held the offices of Pat Garrett and also C.B. Eddy, who was the founder of Eddy, soon to be Carlsbad. And then it turned into the Carlsbad Irrigation District. And they had their offices upstairs for years. And a lady that was very possessive of her office and everything was supposed to have been killed by a jealous woman or a jealous wife or something. And she still haunts the Trinity Hotel. And so he came to our historical meeting, and he made these wonderful stories about not only the hotel, but also of Seven Rivers, which is a very small little town just north of Carlsbad, between our Carlsbad and Artesia. And that's where he has his winery and vineyards there. And there is, back in the 1980, they had to move the cemetery from the Seven Rivers up to Artesia because they were putting in the Brantley Dam. And so they excavated, and at the time, Carlsbad was very little, or Eddy was very little, and Seven Rivers was the county seat. And of course, Eddy was trying to poke fun at Seven Rivers and trying to build themselves up. And the newspapers would say, well, you can read the Eddy Argus at night by the gunfire in Seven Rivers, which is basically true. And then they said that nobody died of natural causes. And when they did the excavation, they found that most of the male graves did have some sort of buckshot or bullets or something along that line involved in their death. So, and I think that some of that, the hauntings that they do have there, the state police supposedly have reports of the mile in front of Seven Rivers as being the most haunted mile in New Mexico, because they have all the reports of the lady in white and people trying to avoid her and going off the road. Del Balzano, who is the owner of the Trinity Hotel and of the winery, states that they have a cowboy on horseback that rides through the building and gets their workers kind of upset. And then there's a little girl who plays in the vineyard and sings and dances and everything. And I think it has a lot to do with the cemetery. They weren't able to find all the graves. And I think the cowboy is an outlaw by the name of Zach Light, who was buried out there, but they never found his grave. And one of the little girl, I believe, could be possibly one of the 1918 flu victims, and I don't think they found her as well. The lady in white is possibly a lady who was a wife of an outlaw, and he was shot and killed out by the caverns, and he was put in a lonely grave out in what we call Rocky Arroyo. And when she died of childbirth a few years later, after she married a cowboy, she was put in a grave across the street from him out there in the middle of nowhere. I mean, it's very lonely. So I think it's her walking the highways looking for her child. And
Thank you for sharing that, Donna. As you were describing that, I had these images like populating, this very, very haunted space.
Yes.
Definitely steeped in like individual and collective history.
Yes.
Really quickly, if you could speak to the question that's in the chat, and then of course we're going to pop it over to Rob, but have you done any exploration around the stories of the hauntings at the Doña Ana courthouse in Las Cruces? Can you speak briefly to that?
Yes, actually, I just sent in my book, Haunted Courthouses and Jails. It was last week. So yes, Doña Ana is very much a prominent part of that. That should come out probably in March.
Noted. Thank you. I think that, yeah, I can see Courthouse is definitely being haunted by quite a few stories and characters. Rob, can you share out with us some of your favorite storytellers?
Well, I'm a historian, so the storytellers that I listen to are people in documents. Whether they're Inquisition documents, civil documents, church documents. It's the voices of people in the past speaking to a certain event, and then a scribe writing it down, and then we read it 300 or 400 years later, and we kind of get to hear those voices from the past. So whether it's a document from 1607 from San Gabriel up in northern New Mexico, near Okeawinge Pueblo, where a woman, Maria de Zamora, a Mexican Indian woman, was accused of using brujeria, witchcraft, to try to kill her son-in-law, or if it's a Inquisition document that describes the Abiquiu cases, the drama of exorcisms that were performed up in Abiquiu by the priest Fray Juan Jose Toledo. That's where I get my stories, if you will, as a historian. Obviously, there are other sources. I mean, I mentioned my family. I heard stories from them, and the people I studied with and studied under as a student. All my professors and people at the Vargas Project, they're also storytellers in a sense. But, with history, it's also about primary sources, about documents, and sussing out what these documents are telling us. Because as Rick mentioned, the language of the scribes, of the priests and government officials of the 1700s is very different from Spanish today, and it's not enough to just know Spanish. So you have to learn the language of that document, of each document, and what they tell you, what those words on the page tell you, and then interpret it.
We have a lot of young people that are in the audience online right now. And I urge you, students, to pop a question in the chat box. And Rob, you used to be a teacher, you were a high school teacher.
Yes.
But when you talk about being a historian, what would you say to maybe the young people that are tuning in, or in general, like, how does one begin that journey? I want to be a historian. Can we be historians? What you spoke to primary documents. Could you speak a little bit to that path that you found yourself on?
Well, you start being a historian by listening to your history teacher in school. Read the books, read the articles that you're assigned, and look at different perspectives of history. If you go to college, your professors are excellent resources on different historical themes and resources. I was lucky. I had great professors. Again, I keep bringing up the Vargas Project. I learned paleography, learning how to read documents from centuries ago. So you're not just listening to professors and people who write books, but you're also doing the analysis yourself. And, just keep doing it. Do it because you love it, but do it because you want to learn about the past, so that you could learn who you are, why you are, and where we go from here. We have to learn from our ancestors. We have to learn from our history, and it's not always comfortable. It's not supposed to just make us feel good. It's supposed to challenge us and teach us. So always be prepared to answer when opportunity knocks. Right, Rick?
Right, Rob.
That's a great segue. Thank you, Rob. So let's kick it over to Rick. Can you share out with us maybe a favorite storyteller that you came across in which you collected that story and shared?
Well, sure. I mean, obviously the storyteller that spoke to me in writing Witches of Abiquiu was Fray Juan Jose Toledo that Rob has mentioned. and this was a man who was living in a world where he was encountering the devil. He had been educated to be able to determine what devil that he was encountering. He knew if he was dealing with Satan or Asmodeus or some other devil. In a way, his training had prepared him for an encounter with the devil. A Franciscan in the century before might have chosen to become a martyr to the faith, but by the 18th century, that was no longer particularly sought out by Franciscans, but a live confrontation with the devil. Now that was something worth having. The stories that he tells, and for him, they're not stories. He's recounting the truth. But I can remember working on the book, and in those days when I was younger, I would write in the middle of the night. And I can remember at 2 o'clock in the morning one night, I was working on a part of a document where Father Toledo is riding his horse through the countryside, and he's attacked by a witch, a warlock, I suppose, properly speaking, who shape shifts into the form of a wolf and leaps onto the Franciscan, to the father on the horseback, drags him off the horse, and they have a fight, and he loses consciousness. And when he wakes up, of course, there's no wolf there, there's no person there. So this description of the shape shifting, which is very common in witchcraft anywhere, but that story was told so vividly that it literally, the hair on the back of my neck stood up as I was reading that in the middle of the night, and it was frightening. I think one of the reasons that the story in that book has been so much of interest to people, every year at this time of year, I'm asked to talk about that book. That book came out in 2006. So it's been out for a very long time, but it really just is a story of the lived experience of this Franciscan. And of course, we have the story only really through his eyes. That all of the documentation is that way. I would echo everything Rob said. As a historian, the storytellers primarily that I encounter are in the documents. And in terms of becoming a historian, that's how you do it. You have to get into the primary sources and come up with your own interpretations. So Father Toledo, for me, is a great storyteller. I think Rob would certainly agree with that. Rob and I will get together and talk about things that would bore most people to death, but they're about things that we find in the documents and stories that are told to us. And one thing leads to another, one project leads to another, and it's almost always a story that we got out of a document.
Gracias, Rick. Well, you're certainly not boring us now. And the wind is picking up outside, y'all, here in the autumnal season where I'm at in a hotel, haunted or not, but I'm in South Dakota, so maybe I'm okay. But I know they have their own stories. So we're going to take some questions from the chat. Here's a great question from Mrs. Culberson. Has anyone heard a version of La Llorona where she kills her children and feeds them to the soldier lover? I wonder how many different manifestations or takes there have been on the Llorona. I think I've heard at least 3 in my lifetime that are really these primary 3 stories that circulate around the Llorona. Can anybody speak to that on the panel?
I will say that was something that was very interesting for me in trying to recount that story, was that there are so many different versions of it. And I felt slightly, I guess, just conscientious of trying to say that there was only one. So that was something that I did address when I wrote about that story specifically, was that there are so many different versions of this story, ranging. I mean, I've even heard of it on the Yellowstone River all the way up in Montana, you know, kind of all across the US. So I haven't heard that particular version where she feeds her children to the soldier, but it sounds terrifying. And I think it speaks to how that story, I think maybe perhaps because of its long history, has sort of branched off into all these different, you know, different versions. It's fascinating. It's really interesting.
I grew up hearing about La Llorona, especially up in Mora. They have acequias up there, the ditches, and they'd say, "Don't play near the ditches. La Llorona will get you. She's looking for her kids, and she'll steal you. She killed her kids, and now she wants to take you." And we'd go play anyway and get in trouble. But no, I never heard that. That's a horrifying version of that story. I never heard that. But you know what? Maybe that's what we need these days to scare these young kids.
That does remind me of the tale, I believe it's Medea, right? Where she kills her children and bakes them in a pie, like a mincemeat pie, and feeds it to her abusive dictator husband. Does anybody run across that? I think it's Greek mythology there. And I've also heard the Llorona be called the Mexican Medea. But you know, it's interesting what you said, Christine, like how stories branch off throughout history, these legends, this lore, but does it make them any nonetheless a part of that journey? It's like a tributary in a river, right? It's still that cultural history, almost like braiding itself into one another to create even this like collective, like a snowball. There's another metaphor, coming down the mountain and collecting more stories and growing. Would anybody else like to answer to that question, or we'll move on to another question in the chat? Okay, so here is another question for you all. Are there primary document sources, and maybe this goes back to Rick, about the Witches of Abiquiu that are available in English instead of Spanish, so that they can use them to learn from the witch trials? So again, are there primary document sources about the Witches of Abiquiu that are available in English instead of Spanish that we can use to learn about those witch trials?
I mean, there are large sections that were translated, but I don't recall. You know, that was so long ago. I mean, I probably translated most of the letters. Rob,
Well, Rick,
I don't know.
Rick, aren't some of those documents translated in the book, The Witches of Abiquiu? I
Yes,
did.
yeah, there are some.
Yeah, and so that's a good source, is the book, Witches of Abiquiu by Rick Hendricks and Malcolm Eber. I think for my master's thesis, I translated a couple of the documents. And doesn't the Cibola Project have a document that they've
They probably do, Rob. Yeah, I mean, I would say the entire body has maybe never been translated, but it's entire. I mean, if somebody wants to contact us, we can probably put together some of them, and I may have more that I mean, again, that's a long time ago. There have been a lot of book projects between 2006 and now. I'm not sure, but I know in order to work with them that the main reason I got involved was to translate the documents. So I probably did translate most of them.
That's an excellent question that I think is probably coming from a teacher, right? So if it's okay, maybe Bethany can type in the email addresses, if you are willing, panelists, in our chat for teachers to reach out to you for some materials for their classes, or for you to point them in the right direction. Because I think about this too, right? Estudiantes that are also in the audience is like, where do we begin when we want to write a research paper? When we want to write a piece of, we want to gather information. Sometimes the internet, we don't know where to begin. So perhaps you can steer folks in the right direction to more primary sources to discover, or sources that, are valid. So thank you so much for that. And hey, here's another witch trial question. This is from Michelle. Muchas gracias, Michelle. Have there been any other witch trials in New Mexico outside of Abiquiu?
Yes. Nothing so elaborate. Rob, since you talked about several of these yesterday, why don't you?
Rick is correct. I think the most detailed and fantastic of them is the Abiquiu case, because that one gets sent to the Inquisition in Mexico City to be investigated. But the ones that I've spoken to and that have been written about by people like Mark Simmons and other historians that go into the 1600s and into the 1700s, they're not so much trials as much as they are investigations. There are accusations made. Somebody says that person put a curse on me, or that person is using love magic against me, or malojo, evil eye. And then the priest might take down some testimony, and typically they would be considered superstition and gossip, and it's kind of anticlimactic. They really wouldn't go anywhere, but you got some really fascinating insight into the psychology and the society of New Mexico, because something stayed with me that Rick said earlier. New Mexico was a frontier of the Spanish Empire, but then towns like Abiquiu and Las Trampas, they were frontiers of the frontier. They're really out on the edge of the territory, and there's a lot of cultural mixing and cultural conflict and clashing, and so there's a lot of curses being thrown back and forth. So that's what you see happening here, and a lot of times they're just investigations. There's no trials like you see in Salem or in Abiquiu in the 1760s.
I like how you mentioned there were a lot of curses being thrown back and forth. That sounds like your average wedding that you go to from my family, but that's another panel.
That's New Mexico.
That's New Mexico for you. There's a really great question. Thank you so much for this question. A student has asked if the panel has written or come across stories of La Lechuza. I remember being told about La Lechuza, right? When I was younger, and I remember how much it scared me when I was younger. Also, a lot of other stories about birds, talking crows and whatnot. Does anybody know anything about La Lechuza, or have you done any research on it?
I have not. I'd be interested in learning more, frankly.
I have not either, but my dad used to apple, who supposedly would turn into a toad. And this was in the newspaper. That's the kind of thing I find fascinating. When it actually makes it into the newspaper, then there's something going on there. I don't know what was going on. Maybe he just looked funny. I don't know. But they said when they would go hunting, he would just sit by the fire and his eyes would bulge out of his head and he'd blink like a frog or a toad. So he was called El Sapo. But Lechuza, I've not heard of that one.
So I haven't heard the story, but there are lechuzas or tecolotes or búhos in Abiquiu, to be sure, and many of you are familiar that in the Hispanic and the Native American culture that tends to be a negative marker. I hope everyone who's listening will have read Bless Me Ultima, and of course. Rodolfo Anaya turns it around, right? In that book, the tecolote is a harbinger of good. So I've never done any research on that because I don't do that sort of research. But through the story of Abiquiu, there definitely were owls, and that's another interesting thing. Here in New Mexico, we have a number of different ways to refer to that particular animal, which is kind of interesting. right? Lechuza normally would be like a small owl. And of course we use tecolote, which is a Nahuatl word. And then in Spain, it'd be a bujo normally. So we get all of those and the richness of the Spanish language in New Mexico.
Well, too bad my Theo Ben isn't a panelist because he could tell you all the stories about Lechuza, and that's who I heard from when I was little. And to me, when you're younger, it sounds like fact. So it was factual. You know, of course, my Theo Ben would never fib to me about the owl that would follow him home regularly, this little white owl. I'd be interested in the stories that you heard for the student who posed the question. You can always type that in the chat. Who did you hear it from? And that's interesting. When I think about our story keepers, they oftentimes first come from family members or people in your pueblo or your village, right, in your community. And I know you were talking about source documents and you know, where you can do your research, but you know, some of our beloved storytellers we grew up with. And I want you all to think, young people that are tuning in and folks just across our time together, like who are the storytellers in your life, both past and present, and how do you embody storytelling as well? Okay, so in the spirit of storytelling, why don't we go through the panel again? I have a question for you all. What's a spooktacular story that you've come across? Maybe you were a child when you were told it, or maybe it's something you came across in your research and your writing, but that really made that hair stand on the back of your neck. I think Donna spoke to that, being really spooked. But what's a maybe a story that you were told, or even a firsthand, dare I say, a firsthand encounter? So we'll pop it. I'm going to just kind of popcorn around now for folks. And I'm going to pop it over to Christine.
Okay. Oh, wow. Well, in thinking about your uncle telling you stories, one that comes to mind for me is one that my mom told me growing up. She's a practicing Catholic, and she was walking home one night, late at night, after college. She was by herself and feeling, you know, fine, just walking down the road. And all of a sudden she notices this car pulling up behind her and driving very, very, very slow and sort of following her. And as a young woman, she became frightened. And so she started praying, and she said, you know, please just send a guardian angel. Please just somebody protect me, get me home safe. And continues walking, continues praying. And all of a sudden, out of the woods, this ginormous dog just comes bounding towards her and heels right at the side of her legs and walks with her the rest of the time home until she gets to her dorm room. This was just a story that my mom had kind of raised me and my siblings with about I suppose in her mind, the power of prayer and the potential for a guardian angel to come and protect you in a moment of need. But the fact that she had come back to her dorm room, closed the door behind her, and then this massive dog was gone. I think it was just, you know, it was a tale that we always grew up with and really resonated with us. And I think as we've been talking about, so many of these stories have sort of cautionary or maybe moral or ethical underlining ideas in them. And I think for my mom, she told us this story as a way to, you know, rely on both prayer and our guardian angels for our protection. So.
Thank you, Christine. Who else would like to respond to that question?
I'll tell a story. In the course of doing my research for my master's thesis, which was about the Abiquiu witches and witchcraft in general in New Mexico, in the document, the priest had some phrases that were in Latin. So I went to a local priest here in Albuquerque, a Jesuit priest that I knew, and he was helping me. He helped me translate. And I had done research into exorcism and possession because that happened in the Abiquiu case. So I asked him, I'd researched The Exorcist, the book and the movie, to the original case from 1949. Exorcism took place in St. Louis. And I asked him, where did you go to school? He said, St. Louis University. I said, when? He goes, 1948 to 1952. And I'm like, did you hear about that little boy that they performed an exorcism on? He goes, oh yeah, the whole campus was buzzing because of that case, because of that situation. And I asked him, did you ever know who the exorcist was? He goes, oh, he was my professor. And I asked him, then I said, well, what did he think about it? What did you think about it? He goes, well, I saw him many years later, and we asked him, some of the students, we asked him, what did you think of the book and the movie? He goes, oh, it was a lot worse than that. The real thing was a lot worse. So that kind of made me go, wow, you know, because here's something that wasn't from the 1760s. It wasn't from happening in Transylvania or something. It was something that happened in the 20th century. And just like those stories we read about in the documents, quien sabe? But you have to keep an open mind about these things because we weren't there and they were.
That absolutely terrifies me, Rob, because I remember, well, you know, the movie came out and then it would come on television sometimes late at night, and I was a little girl, and I would just see that face of, you know, the possessed girl, and it would just totally frighten me. Many years later, I read the book when I was an adult. You would think that I would stay away from it, but it's interesting how we're still like moths to a flame, you know, with all the things that spook us out. But thanks for sharing that. Let's pop it over to somebody else.
Okay, I have a story of whenever I was writing the book on haunted hotels, I was invited to Rodi, New Mexico, which is just above Las Cruces. And it was in a former Catholic church that they turned into a bed and breakfast. And they brought in a paranormal group and to do like an investigation. And they started in the church itself, which has two priests buried underneath the altar that died under mysterious circumstances. I believe one was poisoned and the other one they thought was murdered outright. And they have they set up a grid and they set up the whole 9 yards with the EMPs or whatever they call them, and really didn't get a whole lot of activity. Outside in the courtyard was a little grave of a little boy about 15 years old. He's a gypsy boy who was killed in the late 1800s. And they asked, the parents were traveling, and they asked the priest if they could bury their son on the consecrated ground, and it was allowed. And I was sitting there in the audience, and a cricket started just chirping very loudly from that area, from his grave. And crickets are very prominent in Romani legend and everything. So I thought, oh, okay, you know, he's listening. And then they decided, well, we're not getting much here. Let's go into the little casita, which was where I was staying. And so I thought, okay. So we moved into the casita, and everybody lined up, and it's a big area, big room. And they started talking with the flashlight and not getting a whole lot of response. Well, they started talking in Spanish. And the minute they started talking in Spanish, they were getting responses, immediate responses. And I thought that was just fascinating. We found out that he was killed by his brother. He was 15 years old, and he was kind of fun. He liked to play in the courtyard. He liked to play pranks on people, and it was fun to be around him. Well, after everybody left, of course, I was by myself in this room, thinking, you know, this spirit is still here, and I couldn't get comfortable, but I finally fell asleep a little bit, and all of a sudden, this room was like the vestibule, and there was the sacristy, and then there was the church itself, and the door slammed between the church and the room I was staying at. And I didn't get much sleep that night, thinking, okay, it's only 4 hours to Carlsbad. Maybe I could make it. So the next morning they asked me if anything happened. I said, well, did you guys go in there and lock up last night? Well, no, we didn't. So I'm just thinking that somebody was playing a prank on me. by slamming the doors.
That's a good way of looking at it. It was just a prank, Donna.
Right.
Rick, can you share something? Will you tell us a spooky story?
Well, the other than the story that I shared with you of the shapeshifter, Rob has mentioned the stories of the exorcism, which are pretty they're pretty spooky. In my life, I can't honestly think of a single encounter with the supernatural, anything like that. I yeah, I'm really at a loss for that. I mean, although I'm a historian, I do have sort of a scientific bent, I suppose. And I'm not really a believer in those types of things. So yeah, I
Yeah.
can't really add too much there.
Fair enough. I remember once as an undergrad at UNM, I think I was required to read Dante's Inferno for like maybe the third time. It was cross-listed in all these classes I had, and it never really quite spooked me until one night. Nothing supernatural happened. I didn't hear anything or see anything, but I remember reading it, and I was by myself in a quiet room. And Dante also sketched the cantos as he went deeper and deeper into hell, if you know the story of Dante's Inferno. And I remember getting an overwhelming feeling of fear, but nothing happened, right? Scientifically speaking, there was no supernatural presence, but I think that I was embedded so deeply in the story that I physically reacted to it, like the goosebumps and whatnot. So here's my next question for you all. And then, we want to save some time so that we can hear the ballad of La Llorona before we part our ways. But what do you think the fascination is? Folks want to read your books. They want to learn about the Witches of Abiquiu and haunted hotels and spaces and crawl spaces. They want to hear the story and the song of La Llorona. What do you think the fascination is with why people are drawn to those kind of stories?
Well, I mean, I think different people are drawn for different reasons, but one of the things that has been told to me on a number of occasions is I've had people say to me, I like to be scared. Which is very odd to me. When I was a kid, I on Saturday afternoons, my sisters would watch Shock Theater, which on television, little black and white television, showed all the classic horror movies, Wolfman, Dracula, Creature of the Black, all those types of things. And I would hide under the kitchen table. I was not interested in being scared, and I really don't choose scary movies, but that's one thing that I've heard very, very frequently. People will say, I like to be scared. I'm sure there are many, many other reasons, but that's the one that I think I hear the most frequently when people talk about why they're interested in witches now. Yeah, that's what I hear most frequently. They just enjoy being frightened.
Maybe that's why we like roller coasters. Rob, can you speak to that question? Why the
Yeah, exactly. That's what I would say. What Rick said. Then you just hit it too, Jessica. Why do people like roller coasters? They're scary. It gets our adrenaline going. And I also think there's something primordial about it. There's something that goes back into our beginnings that is cathartic. Maybe it's a way of confronting our fears. I'm Roman Catholic, so I do believe that there's something out there that keeps me from getting all the things I want. You know what I mean? And I think we're physical beings, but we're also spiritual beings. So when we see a human being, we're like, oh, cool, there's a fellow human being. But when we see a dead body, it freaks us out. It's like that's not supposed to just be a body with no spirit. Or if we see a spirit, it's a ghost, and that freaks us out, because it's supposed to have a body attached to it. So all of this plays into something, whether it's witch tales, demons and devils, werewolves. I love those old movies. My dad used to get concerned because I'd read the old monster magazines and he'd say, "Mijo, that's going to warp your mind." And he was right. It did. But, I can't help myself. I do like that stuff, but there is something to be said for that. I don't know why people like it. They really do. And they have for generations.
Christine, what do you think?
I think that people like the potential that can exist within the unknown. So maybe, our world can seem so concrete, and, we experience it from our five senses, and, we know this couch is here because we can feel it. So I think the potential for something mysterious to exist that's sort of can spark our imagination, or is unknown or greater than us, or the more powerful than us. I think that potential is something that people really, I think, just find fascinating. And I think it encourages their own imagination and their own curiosity. So they're drawn to it.
And that reminds me of yet another, you wrote in the beginning of your book, Christine, for my beautiful mother, Donna, for my beautiful mother, Dorothy Blake, who passed her sensitivities on to me. I thank you for this gift. What are your thoughts around that question? Why are people drawn to stories like this? What are they maybe seeking?
Kind of maybe truth, or maybe proof that life goes on in a different plane. Possibility. I mean, I was raised Catholic too, and so I know, the sense is that way. But it just, maybe it's an unknown thing. It's thrilling, because if something like when that happened to me at the plaza, I sought it out, but then it was frightening. But it gave me a sense that, okay, this is true, this is real, I experienced it. So I'd like to pass those kind of experiences on to others, so that maybe they won't think that they are strange, or if something happens to them, it because I was raised with, there's no such thing as ghosts, no such thing as ghosts, and it's been proven to me several times that that's just not true. So I don't know. It's just the unknown factor. I agree with everybody on the panel on that. It's the unknown factor.
Thank you. Well, hey, Rob, I know that you have a special parting gift for us, and, it makes me think about storytelling in all modalities. We read a story, we're carried on through the words in the text. We view a piece of art. We're audience members in theater, and we're watching a movie or a live performance. What about storytelling through song? And Rob, can you tell us a little bit about, your history with being a musician, a singer, and the power of storytelling behind that, and maybe a little bit, Rob, about the Ballad of La Llorona before you share it with us.
Well, the music is very powerful, and it's just another medium through which we express our emotions, our experiences, our communities, joys and sadness and catastrophes. So in New Mexico, you have corridos, Mexican ballads, and inditas, little Indian songs, which shows our cultural blending. And a lot of this is rooted in romance music from Spain, brought during colonial times. The La Llorona is obviously the story of a woman who kills her children because of the abuse of a man. And so it's very haunting. So what I'm going to do, look, I have a guitar right here. So my computer's been hexed or something, so you won't be able to hear the guitar, but I'm going to sing a couple verses of La Llorona about this amazing woman who has a catastrophic life, but goes on and never gives up. Todos me dicen el negro llorona, negro pero cariñoso. Todos me dicen el negro llorona, negro pero cariñoso. Yo soy como el chile verde llorona, picante pero sabroso. Yo soy como el chile verde llorona, picante pero sabroso. Ay de mí, llorona, llorona de ayer y de hoy. Ay de mí, llorona, llorona de ayer y de hoy. Yo soy como el chile verde, llorona, picante pero sabroso. Yo soy como el chile verde, llorona, picante pero sabroso. There you go.
Échale. You invoked the spirit of La Llorona and Chavela Vargas.
Thank you. Muchas gracias.
We still have some time, so I kind of want to unpack a little bit more about the power of storytelling through songwriting, and I feel like you're the person to maybe share that with us. And when we especially think about it through the lore of, let's say, La Llorona, why is that? Why that medium? Can you tell us a little bit about your thoughts around that?
Well, I mean, I can tell you this. I come from a musical family. It sounds like a cliche, but it's true. My late father, Roberto Martinez, was a corridista. He composed corridos. He wrote corridos about Daniel Fernandez, who died in Vietnam, who was from Los Lunas. He died in 1966. He wrote corridos about Reyes Lopez Tijerina and the courthouse raid at Tierra Maria in 1967, and on and on and on. And I just think that music is for everyone. Music is for everyone. Fact is, if you go to New Mexico in the 1800s, 1700s, 1600s, documents were for the elite. They were for the priest, for the governor, for the scribe. But everyone could sing a song. Everyone could listen to a song. So if you had an indita about Manuel Maez, a buffalo hunter, a cibolero, everybody knew what was going on when it talked about his death, when he sings, what does he sing? Let me get my guitar. Caballo alas santo estado, que tú la muerte me distes. Caballo prieto mentado, que tú la muerte me distes. Tu cuerpo quedó bañado, con mi sangre te tenistes. This is a sad lament about life on the frontier, hunting, living, and dying. And so that's what music is. It's music for people, whether they could read or write or not. It's kind of like the sculpting you see at Chartres in France, the medieval cathedral. It's the Bible in statuary and sculpture. You didn't have to be able to read to learn the Bible stories. Well, that's what music is. That's what these songs are. Corridos, inditas. It's music by the people, for the people.
Thank you. That recalls thoughts too around teatro campesino.
Yeah.
Thank you. We got a bonus, y'all. We got to hear a little bit more of Rob's lovely voice. We really appreciate that. Thank you so much. Just real quick, panelists, what's next for you? What are you working on as far as any kind of writing? We'll just do this really quickly and then we'll close out our time. Rob, we'll start with you. We'll pop it over to Rick and then we'll speak to Christine and then, of course, our last panelist to share out what Donna, you're working on. So yeah, what you working on?
Well, believe it or not, being state historian is no walk in the park, right, Rick? It's a lot of work. It's a full-time job. I love it. But right now I'm working on a governor-appointed commission about the 250th anniversary of the revolution in 1776, the American Revolution, but I'm going to be focusing on what was going on in New Mexico in 1776 and looking at a document by Fray Atanasio Dominguez, a priest who came here in 1776 and wrote a report about us, describing us, how we spoke Spanish, our churches, our towns, our landscape. So that's pretty much what I'm going to be focusing on in the near future. And I'm always writing little articles and getting things together for our state historian website, our Office of the State Historian website. So that's it for me. Next.
Thanks, Rob. Maybe you can employ the New Mexico State Poet Laureate, Lauren Camp, to write a poem for you with your work. All right.
You never know. You never know.
Rick, what are you working on?
Well, so I'm working on a story, a biography of a German who came to New Mexico in the 19th century, and was a murderer, newspaperman, kind of a big departure for me to be working that recently, 19th century. But it's a really fascinating story. And then I have a back burner project, which is a biography of a priest, a Spanish priest who came here, which I've written several different ways, and probably will maybe go to my grave without having finished it. But those are two writing projects that I've got going.
Well, if you go to your grave without finishing it, you should come back and haunt us with your stories.
And I may well do that.
Thanks. All right, Christine, what you working on?
Oh, right now, so my full-time job is working for Western Art and Architecture. So I primarily write about art and architecture of the West for the magazine, but I also have some back burner projects. I'm working on a collection of short stories about the sort of environmental short stories. And then I'm also working on a novel about police violence and mental health.
You sound like a very busy writer. And also thank you for being a knowledge keeper and sharing your knowledge with us on this panel and then through your writing as well. Appreciate you. Thank you so much. Donna, take us home. What you working on next?
Like I said, I've got the haunted courthouses and jails in, and my next project is haunted restaurants and bars, which will be terrible to research. It's just going to be awful. I don't know how I'm going to do it. And then my next one I'm working on is a biography about Bronco Sue, who is New Mexico's first female serial killer. So that was a fun one. That's a fun one.
Oh, it sounds like a blast. And if you need like a writing, drinking buddy companion, Donna,
Sure.
you have my email address. Okay. I like spooky stories and I like spirits. Get it? Spirit?
You got it.
Yeah. Okay, done. Thank you everybody for joining us today as we talk about a supernatural journey into our state's history with the New Mexico Humanities Council. And of course, our amazing panelists, writers, cultural knowledge keepers. Thank you so much for sharing with our community. And thanks for everybody who tuned in. I'm going to pass it over to Bethany so she can close us out. But thank you for allowing me to be in conversation with you all.
Yeah, thank you all so much for your generous time and great conversation. And thank you so much, Jessica. That was a great discussion you led us through. I am putting in the chat a link to a survey so that you can offer us your feedback on this program. Here that is. We are a statewide organization. We serve our community through programs like this one. And so your feedback really helps us and it helps us to grow and strengthen our programs. So thank you for taking the time to do that. And our executive director, Brandon Johnson, if you want to say a few words.
Yeah, thanks, Bethany. Thanks to the panel for a great program. It was a lot of fun. Learned a lot as well. I just